If you're looking at different insurance limits, you're probably coming up with the question is, how much liability insurance should I carry on my policy? And there's three types of liability insurance that you can or should likely be purchasing. You've got your auto insurance, which we'll start with, your home, and then what's called a personal umbrella, also known as a liability policy. The auto is probably the most common question that we get is, how much should I actually carry? Well, since we're in Michigan, that's less of a hard question because the cost of having higher liability limits in our state is fairly low. The reason being is we have our own medical. It's that no-fault piece of the state where most of us carry something called personal injury protection. And that covers us if we get injured in an accident for the medical. That reasoning is because we don't have to normally pay out those claims as heavily because we're already paying for it on the side. And that liability piece doesn't raise it like other states would because we're not on the hook as much for that medical part. Now it gets a little bit more detailed, and I'll link a video at the end that goes over the personal injury protection a little bit further in depth if you're curious to learn more about that. So Mark, get to the point. How much liability should I carry? There's a couple factors that you've got to think of. The first thing is the easiest way to think of it is how much are my assets, my income, my future income, essentially compared to how much I need to cover. If I'm necessarily worth a net worth of 100,000, which is probably common, close to or lower, is a lot of people, right? You have the 100,000 on up, then you need to carry a little bit more than that so that someone would go after your insurance before they would go after you. That also plays a factor if somebody was visiting Michigan. Now remember, the coverage that we have that lowers the risk is because people live in Michigan. Well, if someone in Michigan didn't have the right coverage or had a gap in their policy to where they didn't have any personal injury protection, or if someone from Florida or Arizona or Ohio or Tennessee or another state visited us, they don't necessarily have the same limits or coverages required for medical. In that case, my bodily injury, that's a liability coverage, is going to cover a per person and a per accident amount. The recommended you see online is 100,000 per person, 300,000 per accident. I'm going to kind of break that up and say it should be the next level up, especially in our state, for two reasons. One, it's cheap. It's not expensive to go to the next level for the 250,000 per person and 500,000 per accident. Actually, sometimes it's even cheaper. That's where having the right agent does play a factor as far as who you're working with and them knowing which companies have good prices for what levels of limits. It's the risk profile that we talked about in previous videos. So in that scenario, if I had to pay out a claim for liability, if I had $100,000 per person and there was multiple people in that car, that common coverage would max out at that $300,000 limit. If I didn't have enough to cover that, then they would have to either go to their own insurance and go after what's called uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. And if that wasn't enough, then they would have to come after me. Unfortunately, I have seen a few times where people do carry those lower liability limits. And a lot of people don't realize that liability isn't just the physical bodily injury. It's what you're liable for. So property damage is also a liability. If you're only carrying $10 or $25 or $50,000 property damage, what happens when you hit a really nice BMW? You hit a large SUV, that's a $60,000 vehicle. You might cover 50, now you owe 10. That's the unfortunate part of that, is now you're kind of stuck in that loophole to where you didn't have enough liability limits. The auto is easy to understand, especially like what we mentioned before, the cost of having a higher liability limits is actually sometimes cheaper. If not, it's not much more expensive to have that. Now there are certain scenarios and profiles where it does make sense to carry a lower liability limits, especially if you don't have a lot of income, assets, or can't afford the cost of the insurance that you're currently paying. That leads us into the homeowner's policy. That's the same as renters. Whenever you hear home, that follows renters as well. The liability limits, if you've ever rented a home or purchased a home, they want you to carry as much as possible, but that once again plays a factor. The biggest three things that you're going to want to think of is, what are my assets? Like we mentioned before, how much do I own? What kind of income can they go after? They can go after future income. So if you injure someone and you get deemed at fault in court and you have to pay back X amount, they can deduct your paychecks for a certain time frame of whatever that needs to be to pay it off. I personally don't want to live on 30% less income and don't think I actually could with 3 kids, but I would try and live life, right? But I would rather have the right insurance coverage to protect me in that scenario. By the way, if you are shopping for home, auto, or personal umbrella policies, I'll put a link in the description below where you can reach out to us. We'll go over and have a conversation with you and help you determine what liability limits are best for your scenario. The second big piece that a lot of people don't think about is, what are your activities? If you own a boat and you're traveling on the water, if you like to go skiing, if you like to go out and be interactive, that also plays a factor because now your risk of liability is higher. Insurance companies don't necessarily rate for that because they don't ask whether you're a skier or if you like to drive. Obviously, they'll insure your boat and they'll ask those pieces with the last piece we're going to talk about. But they don't necessarily ask that part of it. That's something you should mentally make note of, is what is the risk of me doing something that I'm liable for? If you throw parties at your house, whether you did it on purpose or not, someone may get injured and they will go after your insurance or you for either negligence or some reason that they need to cover whatever that scenario is. And yes, kind of reverting back to the auto, there are minimum liability limits you have to carry, so that does also play a factor. That's kind of the third piece. For home, you don't have to carry any coverage at all. For renters, yes, sometimes you do, because if you rent a location, a lot of times they'll require that you have at least $100,000 or $300,000 just to stay in that apartment or the building that you're in, so that they're not liable for something that you could have caused by accident. Keep in mind, none of these matter if it wasn't by accident. If you meant to hurt someone or injure someone, or you're something that you're liable for and it was due to malicious activities, then yes, your insurance is going to deny you either which way. To add one last kind of 0.20 or whatever the case is, if you have a family, you are likely at a larger liability risk. When you have kids that are under 25, that does play a factor as far as the cost if you're doing home, auto, and umbrella policy. Commonly you would, just because you don't know what could happen. Your kid's at a friend's party and something happens at the party and everybody in the house gets sued. You have no control over that scenario, whether your kid was involved or not. Just them being at that location unfortunately puts you into that liability risk. That leads us into the third piece, which is your umbrella policy. We've made a few videos on this channel, and I'll link whatever I can below or in the end of this video, but umbrella policy essentially covers that scenario. If something that you are liable for outside of your home or outside of your car or in general. Now your home does follow you, so if you have a $500,000 worth of liability, that's great. But then what happens if that $500,000 runs out? The umbrella is there to kick in after the fact. So if you're on a vacation and you don't like someone's hat, you tell them vocally and now they sue you because of defamation. I don't know, some sort of reason. If you're having a friend over and someone gets injured, those scenarios can happen, and they actually happen fairly often. It's one of those things where if you've spent the last 20, 30, 40 years of your life working towards a career, working towards a path, you don't want to put all of that at risk. If you've got young family members, then it's good to protect yourself just in case you are the legal guardian of someone, or if you have any type of risk that could occur from something beyond the limits that you carry. If the auto maxes out, that umbrella kicks in and pays the additional difference up to the limit. Most people carry $1 million to $2 million umbrella, and for those that have a lot more income and assets, you can raise that to $5 million or even higher. Same scenario with the home. Someone gets injured or you're outside of the house and that $500,000 or even $1 million that you carried wasn't enough. Then that extra $1 million or plus will kick in and pay the difference if something were to happen. That way, if you did get involved in a lawsuit, your insurance company is typically going to help defend you, but there's cost to that. Not always winning the lawsuit is the benefit, because your coverages are being deducted from that. I know it's an old show, but if you go back and look at the Tiger King, that was the coolest show at the time, right? There was a big lawsuit involved where I think Karen or the lady was suing the Tiger King. And at the end, if you notice that they said, how much did you get out of the lawsuit? Because she ended up winning. She said, I didn't get anything. I actually sued him and it cost me over what it cost me to win the lawsuit just to win. Hopefully this wasn't too confusing. Those are the three main pieces of liability. You've got your auto liability limit, your home, and your personal umbrella. The limits you should carry are determined on the level of risk that you think you could be at, the income or future income that you plan to have, the assets that you currently have. If you have secondary homes, boats, motorcycles, any type of toys, commonly you're going to want an umbrella policy with at least $1 million or more coverage. If you want to learn more about the liability and the coverages of car insurance, I know we mentioned the personal injury protection. I will link that video there. If you're looking to learn more about just general insurance policies, starting with the auto, I'll link our Car Insurance 101 where we go more in depth on the Michigan's laws and the insurance coverages that you should carry for car insurance. I'm Mark with Valor Insurance. I'll see you soon.